This presentation is for developing and monitoring rigorous student learning outcomes. An SLO supports student achievement. It's a measure of a teacher's impact on student learning within a given interval of instruction, and it has to be carefully planned. Today's outcome is that you'll be able to examine that process in order to develop and monitor a rigorous SLO. An SLO is a long-term academic goal informed by available data that a teacher or a team of teachers sets for a group of students over a period of time. I want you to look at this graphic and kind of figure out where you are in terms of understanding that process. So hopefully, because we're going into our 4th year of creating student learning outcomes, that you are on the higher end of this spectrum. If you still need additional support, you can always come to me to learn a little bit more if you feel like you just understand the definition of it, or you are just getting to understand the importance. Hopefully you are starting to see how your SLO should be incorporated into everyday instructional practices. The part of the SLO development process first starts with you coming up with something that you think that your students may struggle with, part of the curriculum or content that you know students usually have some difficulty in. After that, your department chair and team members may also assist you in narrowing down the scope of what you want to focus on. You may decide as a department to focus on one particular area. You can always meet with me to help glean more information about the process, and then at the end the administrator has to approve the SLO. Only administrators can approve it. So even if you go through meeting with me, your department chair, you may still get some feedback from the administration. This is the SLO template and the one that we need to use to record the SLO in. So remember that this template is on the shared drive in the teacher evaluation folder. It's also on the intranet, and I'll show you in a little bit in this presentation how to get to that. The interval instruction for an SLO needs to be done and completed by February 28th of 2017, but it can be finished earlier. You can focus on the entire time frame between now and February 28th, or you can look at a particular unit of instruction. So an example could be you want to start between October 30th and February 5th, because that's something that you're going to cover, a unit that you're going to cover, and you want to focus on a particular skill for students within that unit. So the first thing is looking at, after you figure out what you want to focus on, are your targets and evidence. You want to consider these questions. What progress or mastery will be obtained by the end of this interval of instruction? How are you going to reflect the progress and mastery of the outcomes in percentages or numbers? Targets may be tiered, because if you're looking at a group that is very diverse, you may decide that not everyone will be able to attain the same goal. You also need to be able to look at one source of evidence to show what students were able to attain within that time frame. So an example could be 85% of students will increase their ability to solve linear equations by 25 points. Another example, depending on different content areas, could be their ability to use primary resources. It could be their ability to create a theme or a thesis statement. So it just depends on your content, but you may want to think about what skill in particular you want students to be able to master. And then you also want to think about how long you need for that, or is it an entire unit? Is it something that you're going to be able to do quickly? But you need to be able to pre-assess it, monitor it using any kind of sources or tests or assessments that you have, classwork assignments, but then also have a post-assessment to show you whether or not students have been able to master that goal. Next, you'll want to describe the rationale for the target, answering questions like how was this target chosen, How did you determine that it is a rigorous target? And what pre-test or baseline information informed your decision? It would be really beneficial to bring the pre-test to your meeting with your administrator. Start by giving some type of diagnostic now so that you can determine what areas of need your students have and then use that data to create your SLO. You may decide as a department that you can use data from fourth quarter to make that decision, or map data to make that decision. That would still classify itself as pre-test baseline information. But whatever it is, you want that to be a part of your rationale. So an example could be the Common Core identifies persuasive writing as a critical area for grade 8 during the previous school year. An average of 89% of students in grade 8 demonstrated the need for improvement in that area. So again, you can use data from the previous school year, or if you have given some sort of diagnostic, you could use that information and bring that. So tiering our targets, this was new last year, so we'll go over it briefly, but this is something that you may want to consider when you don't think all of your students are going to meet the. Okay, just as teachers differentiate the instruction for students based on their knowledge base, we can differentiate in SLO, and we call this tiering in SLO. So when you're writing your student learning outcome, you may consider the pre-assessment data and choose one of the following 4 examples of growth targets for your students. So a basic growth target means that all students have the same growth target. For example, all of my students will grow by 20 points at the end of this interval of instruction, or 80% of my students will score at least 80% on a post-assessment. The second type is called a simple average growth calculation. Growth targets in this category are determined by a common formula, but each student has a different growth target based on the student's pre-assessment score. So an example for that would be based on the pre-assessment score, students will score halfway between their baseline score and 100. If a student scored 50 on the pre-assessment, the student growth target is 75%. So in this case, not all students would have the same growth target. The third type of tiered growth would be the tiered growth target. In this situation, a group of students together based on their pre-assessment scores, you would group them based on their pre-assessment scores. So an example would be dividing students into 3 or more categories, low, mid, or advanced, and then setting a rigorous yet attainable growth target for each of these groups. So if your pre-assessment score was 0 to 45 points, your growth target would be 65. If it was a 46 to 70 points, your growth would be 75 points. And if you had 70 or higher, then we would expect you to get 85. So an example of that would be based on the pre-assessment scores on this rubric. Set growth targets would be a reflection of the increased score on this particular rubric. So you would be able to say 0 points would get 1. 2 points would get 3, so forth and so on. Okay, then the last type is the advanced tiered target. In this case, students have a tiered target based on their pre-assessment, just like the other one. You would divide the students into 3 or more categories, low, mid, and advanced, just like the regular tiered growth target. Students have to reach the greater of 2 targets. So in this case, if a student's pre-assessment was between 0 and 45, you would say, I want you to get 65 or plus 35 points, whichever is greater. Okay, if it was between 40 and 70, you would say, I want you to get 75 or plus 15 points, whichever is greater. So by advanced, we just mean that we're differentiating it even more. So you will receive a date from the administrator completing your evaluation this year to let you know when you have to have your SLO submitted and approved. Only that administrator can approve your SLO, but you do want to make sure that you've crossed all your T's, dotted all your I's before submitting it, because that is how part of your end of the year evaluation will be calculated. So what you should bring to your approval conference, you want to complete your SLO and have that typed up and put into the correct template. You want to make sure that you have data to support why you chose that target and why you chose that particular tiering. Say, for instance, you have an inclusion class with 5 students with IEPs, a couple 504s, a couple students in there who were in GT last year. That would support why you chose to tier your target or use an advanced tiering growth target. You want to have any assessments that you use or even ones that you plan to use for your post-assessment or maybe midpoint check-in. Any rubrics or scoring tools, especially for how you're going to calculate the SLO growth. Any cross-section of the student's pre-assessment, so if you can show why you chose that tiered target based on those pre-assessments, you can bring that in. And then your previous SLO data may be applicable if you chose to do the same thing. Okay, so monitoring, this is a really big point. It cannot happen once you turn in the SLO and then again when you have to go in for your conference. You need to have a midpoint check-in so that you can decide whether or not that target is too rigorous or if you're on the right track. During the monitoring progress, you as the teacher need to reflect upon how your students' academic needs are being met. This is so that you will decide how to customize instruction, whether or not you need to pull small groups. So it's all a part of the teaching process. They've just made this formalized to make us think through what we really should be doing every day. Does the teacher need to modify the type of support or intervention? So this goes back to what I just said about pulling small groups if you think that certain groups are not getting close enough to their goal for that SLO. And then do you need to make adjustments on the timeline? Maybe you thought you were going to end in December and you need to push it into February. Maybe the target is too rigorous. You need to have another conference with your administrator to change it before your SLO is due. And then you want to make sure that you're collecting evidence because you do need to provide it if you need to have that conversation, and also provide it at the end of the year conversation of how you did check for that learning and make modifications. Okay, so evidence of student learning, this is something we're going to be doing every day, but of course during the SLO process is imperative as you're checking to determine if they've met that goal, but examining the assessments, reviewing your student work, and looking at the data to determine if you need to pull them into small groups, using data during your grade level and department meetings to determine team level or department-wide interventions that you can be using. And then just collecting data on a regular basis, whether it's through your observations, through class discussions, analyzing student work, questioning students, so that you can provide evidence for any adjustments that need to be made. So who's a part of the monitoring process? The administrators during informal and formal observation conferences will be asking you about your SLO. Your grade level team leaders may be using that information during PLCs or embedded monthly meetings about how you are monitoring your SLOs. Department chairs will have a big role as each department normally has one goal that is collective, and they'll be looking at that on a monthly basis. And then of course the stat teacher using the SLO process during professional development and even in how you are put into small groups for your PLCs. But only administrators can approve revisions. So you may have conversations with these other people about, hey, I need to change this, but that is a conversation you have to have with the administration before you can make any modifications. So SLOs are due the last day in February. Teachers have the biggest responsibility, but your evaluator will be using the SLO rating rubric to determine part of your evaluation for the year. Collecting data, I do have a template that's on the shared drive in the teacher evaluation system where you can put in your pre-assessment, mid-interval assessment, and post-assessment, but most departments have their own, so that's something you want to check with your department chair about how you can keep record of the data you're collecting. This is the SLO calculator. You don't really need to know a lot about it other than that the principal will use it, and also that if you don't necessarily meet your goal, that doesn't automatically mean that you have failed your SLO. There are points given on this range of where you are, so you may still see that you've met your growth in your SLO or that part of your evaluation, even if you haven't necessarily met the goal. Okay, you will have to complete the reflection part of the SLO template before your final conference after February, after you've completed the SLO. What should you bring to your post-conference? You want to bring your SLO, your rubrics again, as well as any student work to show how you have been tracking that goal throughout the time frame, as well as the data chart that I showed you, or the one that your department chairs will create, and the SLO reflection. And again, you can find all of the templates on the intranet. You have to go to teacher evaluation and then teacher evaluation resources.